And welcome to the Awareness to Action, what it takes to implement lasting behavioral health change in the workplace. We're thrilled that you've joined us today. My name is Holly Foxworth. In case we haven't met, I'm a registered nurse and I am the marketing manager for content here at Axiom. Also joined by our favorite trio. We have the his and her CMOs. We have the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Scott Cherry, and then Chief Marketing Officer, Dara Wheeler. And then the newest face that we have joining us, I'm sure many of you have seen him before, but he is the newest member of our team, and that is Dr. Les Kertay. And so he is our Senior Vice President of Behavioral Health. So I will have them all introduce themselves momentarily, but before we do that, just kind of give some quick reminders here. We are going to do things a little bit different today. First thing I'll tell you about is at the very top of your screen there on the right-hand side, that has the information about the next event that we're going to have is specific to high functioning anxiety. And I think I'm probably more excited about this one than anyone that we've done before, just because I feel like it's one of those, if the shoe fits, wear it type of scenarios there. I'm sure it's something that we've all struggled with at some point in our life. So it's interesting to see how that it goes from what can sometimes be viewed as your superpower, and you look so put together on the outside, but then when in reality, there's really a lot that's going on behind the scenes there. So I hope that you will join us for that. All you have to do is press right there the Register Now button that's on your screen. You don't have to enter any additional information. Right below that is where the resource section is. That's where you have a copy of today's slide deck. We also have a mental health white paper that Dr. Kertay authored himself. And then also that gives you some information about Tempo Live. And then the last thing I wanted to tell you about was that we are looking for questions today. We recognize that these are sometimes difficult conversations to have. It's not always easy to talk about your feelings or talk about what you may be experiencing. And so, but what we're realizing is that the questions that each of us have, if we can kind of build that trust level up and ask those, be brave enough to ask those questions and have an opportunity to discuss them openly and honestly, it really goes a long way to help others. So whoever has the best question today in the event, we are actually going to be sending you a prize at the end of this. So we want your questions, and then also we will announce who the winner is of that award before we wrap up today. So I think that's it from an announcement standpoint. Team, do you guys want to introduce yourselves? Maybe you want to start with, let's change it up. Let's do Dr. Kertay. Let's let him go first this time. You want to introduce yourself, Dr. Kertay?
Sure will. Hi everyone, and thanks, Holly. So I'm Dr. Les Kertay, Senior VP for Behavioral Health here at Axiom. I am a clinical psychologist by training. I've spent the last 20 years, roughly, in largely around disability and workers' compensation, really focused on workplace mental health. And that's the expertise that I bring to the table.
Awesome. I love it. All right. How about you next, Dr. Cherry?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Scott Cherry. I'm Axiom Medical's Chief Medical Officer. My professional background is I'm board certified in preventive medicine, public health, and occupational and environmental medicine. Those are really specialties focused on population health of the general population as well as specific employee populations. And I've been supporting the military, the U.S. government, and corporate and industrial operations for the past 15 years. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. All right, Dara, tell us about you.
Hi, Holly. Hi, everybody. My name is Dara Wheeler. I'm Axiom Chief Marketing Officer, but I'm also head of product and product innovation. And that's a lot of where my mind is going these days is how do we make things better and how do we make what we do as employers better for the workplace. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you. I'm so tickled that you were able to join us today. All right, so just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going to go and kind of the subjects that we're going to talk about from a larger perspective, basically we're going to kind of talk about some of the mental health issues that are going on, what those issues really are, and that's where we'll get into some of this awareness and how you can convert that over to action, and then also looking at some of the pitfalls that have been identified and why 70% of programs that get put into place from a process improvement perspective tend to fail. So we want to make sure that we can get you set up with all of that information, you know what to be looking for and how it is that you can kind of set you and your team up for success as we dive into some of these issues. So Dr. Kertay, I'll just kind of come to you first and ask, could you kind of talk us through what actually are we talking about in terms of numbers and you know, when we say mental health conditions, or you hear the word diagnosis, et cetera, what does that mean, and how much is this impacting our population?
Well, you know, as you can see on the slide, I mean, this is a huge problem. I think it's important to recognize that it's been a huge problem and has been growing for years. It has certainly become more a part of the conversation since COVID, and a lot of symptoms have been exacerbated by the pandemic itself. Mm-hmm. But, you know, this has been going on for quite some time. You know, at this point, 1 in 4 adults at any given time meets criteria for a diagnosable psychiatric condition. And, you know, some of those, that ranges from mild conditions to quite severe. And it certainly is variable depending on what we're talking about. I do think that it is really important to recognize that in general, psychiatric conditions, and now we're talking about diagnoses, are one of the leading causes of years lived with disability or with disability adjusted life years. I mean, we're talking about shortened lifespan. And it's, you know, several of the disorders are among the leading causes of disability in the world and also in the US. So we're not talking about minor, you know, kind of a minor problem. We're talking about a problem that impacts people individually, and it certainly impacts the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so whenever you're talking about the disorders and those that could be diagnosable, do you have, are there any terms that maybe would be recognizable with that, the types of conditions?
Well, sure. You know, major depressive disorder, bipolar depression, schizophrenia on the more extreme end of the stage. You know, I think that in our vocabulary, we talk a lot about anxiety and depression, which really are symptoms. And those are very widespread. I mean, you know, if we could see the audience, I'd say, you know, anyone who's never felt anxious in their life, please raise your hand. You know, that, like, we've all felt those things. And I think it's, you know, those are symptoms that a lot of us feel. And then sometimes people experience a major depressive disorder that can be mild, moderate, or severe. Now we're talking something that is, you know, a diagnosable entity that, generally speaking, will respond well to treatment. You know, so there's a whole range here that we're talking about, but that'll give you some of those labels.
Yeah, definitely. And so, you know, we had talked I believe at the last webinar about some of the substance abuse and how some of these things can occur at the same time. Is that the same scenario here, that you can have multiple types of symptoms and conditions that can be occurring at the same time?
Yeah, in fact, it's more common than not that people will meet criteria for multiple diagnoses. That's partly because there's a lot of overlap in the definitions. And so, you know, you may warrant a couple of different labels, but it's also important to recognize we're really only dealing with one person. And that's where we want to direct treatment. But yeah, it's quite common. Particularly in anxiety. People with anxiety disorders often meet criteria for multiple anxiety disorders. So that's, and substance use is also a common, you mentioned that, you know, that's a really common comorbidity with psychiatric diagnoses. And in fact is a form of psychiatric diagnosis, but we often think of them as separate. But they tend to run together, and so that's something to always be aware of, and both really should be addressed and treated.
For sure, yeah. That brings up a question about terms that are used, and we refer to things as behavioral health, but you hear it feels like that there's more of a buzz around the term mental health. Can you talk us through what that is, what those differences are, and why they may both be correct, and just kind of based on what the scenario is that you're speaking of?
Well, the language varies, but what we mean when we're talking about this is behavioral health is like a larger container in which we're talking about stress. We're talking about, stress and burnout. We're talking about symptoms of anxiety and depression. We tend to reserve mental health for those conditions that are diagnosable and will really benefit from treatment. And it's not that we ignore people who are severely distressed. In fact, we want to offer things for them. And stress in the workplace is a huge issue that needs to get addressed. But it's bigger than, they may, even if they don't meet diagnostic criteria, so it's not mental health, it's still an important feature. Another thing incorporated in behavioral health are substance use disorders, health behaviors. The fact is that we know that exercise really benefits people's mood, their stress levels. In mild major depressive disorder, exercise is about as effective as an antidepressant. So the behaviors that we have around whether or not we participate in exercise, that's part of behavioral health. So it's a bigger container in which we have these other things.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Well, so kind of as we're going through this then, and we're looking at, I think what I'm hearing you say, what I hear kind of out in society is that it's not so much that this is a new issue that has occurred. These are not new diagnoses that are being discussed, but there are some issues with where this fits in, especially from a workplace standpoint. So what are some of those big barriers that have to be addressed, especially from a workplace perspective?
Well, I think one is just acknowledging that stress, psychological symptoms happen, right? They happen for all of us, and for some of us, it's more severe than others, but it happens to everybody. Everybody has anxiety from time to time. Everybody has disrupted sleep from time to time. So acknowledging that they happen without negative repercussions is important. There's a huge amount of stigma about, acknowledging that, we have a psychiatric condition. Why is an interesting question. Like, why is major depressive disorder more of a problem to talk about than diabetes?
So true.
They're both medical conditions. They both respond to treatment. People get better. So I think that the first important thing that we have to get our arms around is we have to be able to have these conversations without judging people or without people feeling judged. There's a study recently, and I've mentioned this previously on webinars, that something like in the first year of the pandemic, employees reported, about 70% of employees reported having discussed a mental health symptom in the workplace. Of those, less than half reported that it went well or that it was a positive interaction. We need to fix that.
You're exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right. So whenever we talk about some of that stigma and the difference there, just to make for sure that we're all on the same page here, I think that what the overwhelming question is how is it that we as a society move in that direction where, if somebody's out because they're having surgery, if they've had, gallstones, what is it that we do? We all call to check on them and it's like, hey, how are you feeling? Everything's discussed, this, that, and the other. But yet, if it's that of a mental condition or behavioral health condition, it's like nobody talks about it because we have to whisper. Everything has to be quiet, and we don't know what to say. So, do you feel like that we're making some movement in that area, at least from a beginning standpoint?
Well, I think that just the acknowledging how prevalent these symptoms are, that's been a positive outcome of the pandemic. Regardless of whether the numbers have actually changed, I think we're talking about it more, and that's a good thing. Yeah. But you raise a great question. I think there are a couple of things going on. I mean, one is that there is still, even among those of us who wish that it weren't the case, there is still this sense of shame around, a mental disorder. Right? That somehow it's a failing on my part if I have a depressive disorder. But also, I think, as you said, somebody comes back from surgery, it's pretty natural to say, hey, how you doing? Is there anything that you need? Right? Yeah. I think we don't say that to people who are emotionally distressed because we're afraid of what the answer is. Like we don't know. I mean, how many times do you say, "Hey, how you doing?" and the automatic answer is fine.
You're right.
Well, sometimes the answer is, well, honestly, I'm not doing that great, and we're anxious about our ability to respond to that effectively. There are trainings available for that. Mental health first aid training is available to help people with that. But part of it is just getting comfortable having these conversations.
Hey, Les, as you were speaking about that, something popped up and I was just kind of curious. Do you see a difference in stigma and the relationship to mental health differently across different countries and cultures? So is it something as a part of in the United States that we are very individualistic and do take a lot of agency around our overall experience? Is it worse in some ways here than in some other cultures that may be more likely to be more collaborative?
It's a little hard to tell because, for example, in a culture where people kind of where the whole or the community is more the unit of measure, right? People talk about it less. And so it's hard to know whether it's less prevalent or whether it's just people don't talk about it. So it's a little bit difficult to answer that question. I do think that there are some things that are unique in our culture, and that individualism or that belief that somehow we should be able to overcome anything that's mental or that's substance related, that somehow it's a moral failing if we can't handle things. I do think that that's peculiarly Western and probably peculiarly in the U.S. It's a great question.
Yeah,
thank you.
Agreed.
It's just interesting. I was wondering as we were thinking through this. I know a lot of our clients that we work with are international, and I wonder how much they're dealing with kind of some different cultural aspects of how to talk about behavioral and mental health in the workplace, because I'm sure it's different in different cultures, right?
Yeah.
Dare not to put you on the spot here, but as usual. But one thing I will say that I am really encouraged by here, and something that we are doing internally, is making a space where we can talk about things that have occurred, in our lives. And in case you guys didn't see it in one of the most recent newsletters that we put out, Dara had a blog that was there, and it was talking about, she spoke about grief, and Dara, I'll let you kind of maybe touch on that and what you're hoping that was taken away. But I love those types of I like that progressive movement that we're going in that direction. I think it's like if you start at the top, then everybody else will feel more comfortable with having some of those conversations.
Yeah, it was interesting. We had a conversation as a group about different experiences and putting them into the workplace and talking about them, and it was a little bit like a bit of a aha moment as I've gone through a career, and we all have experienced different stages of our own lives through a career. I always say these things on when I used to be in HR, and I've done a lot of hiring and I've done a lot of interviews, and I've always said that we spend a lot of time with our work teammates and our work groups. It's not quite a family, but we spend a lot of time together, and if you don't enjoy a lot of what you do, or try to at least find some satisfaction in the mission of your organization or working with your teams, it's really hard to spend that much time with people that are, in a different setting. It's a lot. So as you're going through different life stages and dealing with parents who are aging or experiencing health situations, you have young children potentially. I think somebody coined the term a few years ago, the sandwich generation of, how we're in this kind of middle of trying to deal with all these things at the same time, as potentially with a lot of career aspirations or career commitments on top of that. And I shared the story of dealing with my father going through cancer treatments and what that meant. And at the time, you just put your head down and kind of do it. And it's taken years and years later to kind of think through and kind of understand everything that I went through. And I still don't know that I do, but there were some key things that I thought, man, if somebody just told me a couple of things, like expect a couple of these things to happen. Like, everybody knows logically, they've heard these things like, yeah, grief isn't cyclical or is cyclical. It's not linear. But when you go through it and you experience it, 5 years into it, and you're telling somebody a story, and then you start tearing up and you realize it really isn't linear. This is not step one, then step two. And there were some things that I've learned, and I hope that other team members of mine can learn something from what I experienced, and to have a little grace and under all of this, that it's something that I hope to share continuously with the team.
I agree. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Dara. I thought it made a huge difference, and we've had so many comments about that. And it usually just kind of takes somebody to be the first one to raise their hand and say, "Hey, it was me. I experienced this myself, and it's okay. It's okay to talk about that." So,
and Holly, just one last thing about that too. Even writing it and kind of opening myself up to the story, I got to the end, sent it to Holly's team for editing, and Chitra said, "Well, what about at the end if it gets too much and reaching out to professional help?" I completely blew past that. I actually got to that point with my grief and my experience where I needed professional help, because I was really like, okay, this is too much for me to do on my own. And I reached out and got some help. And it, like what Dr. Kertay said, it was short term. It wasn't, I wasn't diagnosed with something. I wasn't given a label. I was struggling with grief and depression in a very logical way, right? It's something that makes a whole lot of sense. But I totally forgot that I'd even done that. And so having the Chitra go, oh, and if it does get to be too much, you need help. And it's like, yep, absolutely. And I totally blew past that and didn't even acknowledge the fact that was a part of the stages that I went through too.
Yeah. And isn't that interesting? Talking about stigma, it's like, I imagine that it's harder for people, generally speaking, and we know this is true. It's harder to say, I went to see my therapist, than it is, I went to the doctor today.
Went to the doctor's office, yeah.
Right?
You're right.
Why is that more difficult?
It's a good question. I'm not sure that we all have the answer for that, but it's something that we'll definitely
I didn't pretend to have the answer. I just think it's important to raise the question.
Yeah, sure.
It's part of the stigma, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads us into the next thing that we're going to kind of talk about is that's where this awareness piece comes up. So I think, it's like we assume that everybody understands. And so, but before we can do that, before we can get to that point where we can move forward, we have to make sure that everybody does understand what is included within this umbrella. What is it that we're speaking about? Are these concerns, are these health issues? So whenever you look at kind of the upside of understanding the concept of awareness, Dr. Sharif, why does awareness make sense? Why is awareness the first step usually that you have to take before you can look at the broader picture and start making plans?
Yeah, and I think your discussion from the last slide is a great segue. And so when you think about it, I think especially for behavioral health and mental health, there's really kind of this double-edged sword that cuts very deep, where there's this strong stigma that is heavily negatively associated with behavioral mental health. And so people shun away from it. And then at the same time, or maybe even as a magnifier of that principle, people aren't aware of how prevalent or how common behavioral health challenges are in our country and in the world. And so really you have this perfect storm that just leaves things to fester. And as we know with physical health and also now in behavioral health, if you do not address small things will become big things. And I think that's what really culminates in what Dr. Kertay had presented early on with, a quarter of the country, is dealing with a diagnosable, mental health condition. Then Dr. Kertay actually provided me and several other Axiom members some amazing training that even for myself with my medical degree and just a lot of corporate and military training was very impactful to help me understand more formally and give me tools about the awareness about mental health individually, and also for myself as an individual, but also to help my peers, those who work for me, family and friends. And so I do think as people can become more aware and organizations can become more aware, this is going to enhance understanding about how common it is, but also some very practical and useful tools to not feel so alienated if a friend or close one or even a stranger is painfully obviously in distress from a non-physical issue. And so essentially you're not freaking out if you recognize these symptoms in yourself, or if you recognize it in someone that's around you. And then I'm also hoping that awareness will change the culture of organizations or maybe even the country. Because, Dara, like you said, when you asked Les that question, I am probably familiar with some countries that are actually probably even more, have mental health more stigmatized than the U.S. too. So I'm hopeful that, with, like, as Dr. Kertay has informed me, we've had an epidemic of mental health challenges before COVID, but now it's more in the forefront. So hopefully this will change that double-edged sword to where we have less stigma and more awareness. So it's promising to a degree,
Yeah, for sure. And so whenever we talk about those symptoms and being able to recognize that, so I think what I heard you say was that we want to be able to know so that we can recognize that, hey, that this is, this isn't just me that's having this problem, or it's not so much that I'm the only one that's having this issue. It's, okay, I see that there's a problem that's here and that there is a solution. There is help that can be offered there. And then I also like the other point that you made about that sometimes others will see that in us, and especially if we've advanced further down the line and those symptoms have gotten worse and we're not able to kind of put it all together in our own minds. Do you see that occurring as well, maybe in some of the late stages of some of the other conditions where they may not recognize it? You don't get treatment in the very beginning and things just kind of snowball, and then, your brain's not working at that point, and so it's hard to be very introspective there.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Kertay had a great example of comparing a diagnosable mental health condition to diabetes. And so we actually know there's an early stage of diabetes called prediabetes. And so, diabetes is an issue with regulating blood sugar from a high level. And so there's kind of this gray area where you're not normal with your blood sugar, and then you're not in the diabetic level yet, but it's a warning sign. And most people that are in the pre-diabetic level will go into the diabetic level if they do not take action, which may not be overtly too hard to take, but you do need to seek care. And I think this is exactly the model for behavioral health, where I really love the way you can articulate how behavioral health is different from mental health. So maybe you have a series of behavioral health challenges, stress, poor sleep, maybe a lack of exercise, and then an inciting event happens. And so cumulatively, then you're at high risk. And if you don't recognize it, if your organization or your network, family and friends don't recognize it, it can continue on down that continuum of maybe it's a non-diagnosable, acute stressing disorder to something more severe. And, on the side note, it's interesting, Les, you talked about exercise is as good as an antidepressant. I think I've seen that study, and I can't remember if they've looked at actually exercise plus an antidepressant, but what I would say in general is if you aren't at least exercising a little bit, you are kind of deficient from this very protective state. And so again, since mental health challenges are so prevalent, and we know exercise is a good preventive practice, it's really something to consider because we all get pulled in so many different directions. I think exercise is probably not even on the list of priorities for many of us, Sure.
Yeah. Something else you said that I just wanted to dovetail on for a minute, that I think one of the things that happens when we feel challenged, from a behavioral or mental perspective, we tend to feel alone, right? Mm-hmm. We think we're the only person. So some of this is about acknowledging that these are really commonplace things, and being able to have the conversation early helps us feel less alone. Mm-hmm. And also having, if you see a behavior change in me, I saw that someone asked about, how can you tell? I mean, what you're looking for is behavior change, right? If one of you sees a behavior change in me, all of a sudden I'm not showing up, or I'm, I look distant in meetings or whatever. Mm-hmm. Just asking me how I'm doing helps me feel more connected and makes it less likely that I'm going to progress into something more serious. I know that sounds really simple, but it really is that simple.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I heard somebody say, I'm sorry, real quick. Sorry. I heard somebody say earlier when they were dealing with some substance use issues that people expect it to be the big dramatic intervention scene. When you're addressing some of these conversations, it doesn't have to be this big dramatic intervention thing. It could just be somebody that you're friends with mentioning that something seems a little off, like, hey, you seem to be struggling a little bit, or something doesn't seem to quite be right. What can I do, or how can I help, or is there something I can? Sometimes it doesn't. It's so subtle, and it doesn't have to be this huge dramatic situation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The one piece I was just going to add, because I do think the community or not being alone aspect is so critical for so many health outcomes, mental and physical health. There's these blue zones that are known to have people live into their hundreds regularly. And some of the early thoughts about that were, they're cultures that eat really healthy or always are exercising or walking. They don't use technology or and all these things. And then they've seen actually these areas actually adopt worse and worse health practices, like adopt the standard American diet, which is known to be really, really unhealthy, but they still maintain very low cardiovascular disease, much lower heart attacks and strokes. And the only thing they can really draw from these places is that they actually have an amazing sense of community, that everyone kind of knows everyone. It's not just me by myself against the world. And, I think that speaks a lot to, maybe they're not experts in mental health first aid or even advanced mental health counseling, but just through kind of the magic of being in a tight-knit community, people are essentially kind of checking in on each other. And it may drive each other crazy too. At times you see sitcoms about that, but I do think there is something there about a community, and there's so many different ways to look at the importance of not being alone in this world. And so even if it's reaching out to professional services, right? If you're having a bad day, if you don't have a friend or you don't have someone that's trained in mental health first aid, reaching out to a professional service that can provide that quick intervention is really critical.
True, so true. Well, Dara, I'll kind of come to you next then. And when we talk about, even from a marketing perspective, sometimes it's like our efforts are not actually working. They don't make as much sense as what we intended for them to occur. So whenever we're looking at the counterproductive concept of awareness that comes along with that, what are some of the dangers that come along with that? Can we be a little bit are we too casual in what we say? Do we not take things or see more into them than what actually is occurring? We have a false sense of belief. What are some of the things that can happen there?
Yeah, it's interesting. Even just this slide makes me uncomfortable. I want to jump right into fix. Like, I want to scoot right past this and go right into, okay, now what? Now what do we do? I think somebody in the audience actually asked a question about social media. I think Jennifer asked, with social media playing such a large role in how we are perceived at work and socially, how do we address that online backlash when someone shares their mental health challenges? And I do think this is something that is in process and evolving so quickly. I do think our brains and our societies have a ways to catch up to the technological advances we've been kind of presented with as of today. So I think, again, I want to go straight to fix. But when we think about some of these things, this comes up a lot in mental health first aid too, where you've got the interaction where maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's just a person that is walking by you in a hallway and you say, hey, how you doing? And your expectation is that they're going to say, fine, how are you? And that it's not a real conversation because either we don't have time or we don't want to engage in some of those tough conversations. And that can actually make things worse. And I do think that we've got this, especially in social media, this thing where we think we have to have the perfect persona of somebody who's got their act together. Yep, my kids are always hairbrushed, beautiful outfits on. And there's always that joke of the reality of the situation, which is like there's the Instagram view of my family versus the reality. And I do think this is something that we're going to have to continue to think about how this needs to change over time, because again, this actually makes me uncomfortable, and I want to jump right into like let's fix some of this, because I don't know that this is the way we want to be. And to the point about, we have an understanding of what may be harming us, but it's hard to make a change. That tends to be a bit of the human condition. So we're going to have to kind of learn how to adapt and cope in new ways. But I saw a post from a friend yesterday on Instagram, and she said, I believe in science. Science says, stop staring at your phone before bed. I'll get there. It's like we all acknowledge.
You're exactly right. Yep.
We acknowledge that these things need to change, but the actual act of changing is not easy.
You're exactly right. One of the things that whenever I was looking at some of this information here was that we have really good intentions sometimes of what it is that we're trying to help with, but it actually can cause more harm, if we're not doing it the right way. And one of the things that jumped out at me was the example of, everybody that tweets, there's a tragedy that occurs, and all of a sudden we want to jump on social media, and we're going to change our profile picture to put the black thing up, or, the ribbon thing that goes there for whatever awareness it is, or we're going to, tweet out thoughts and prayers, or you see that from politicians. Like, the world is saying, give me a break. Like, make me vomit. This is ridiculous. Like, is that the best you can do, is say, thoughts and prayers? And is there a place there where that's not enough? Is there a place when we say we're going to become more aware, we're going to take more action, but does that stop right there at social media, or does that stop with having somebody sign a petition that says we need more funding? Where does that go wrong sometimes?
Yeah, and I think this, again, is something that's going to be in flight for a long time. I think we're going to have to adjust the way we operate and what we think. I do think one of the things we're hearing very clearly from employees, especially if we bring this back to the workplace, is that even if an employer is saying, we recognize this is a problem and we need to make a change, the gap between that and implementing real change that's sustainable is there's still a big gap in that authenticity and making the change. So I think that's where I keep coming back to, as leaders, leading with authenticity, leading in my social space, whether it's social media or anywhere else, with that authenticity is really important. So I think that what we're finding is we're finding our way through these really difficult moments in history in new ways, where 100 years ago, if something happened at this scale, we wouldn't know about it until days and days later. And I do think as a society, we're trying to catch up a little bit. And so I don't know that we don't need to go the other direction and stress too much about the harm. We just need to start building awareness and building the ways we want to be authentic in our personal life and our work life, and starting to think how we do make changes. So I think that's, again, let's jump to the how do we make changes, Holly, because otherwise you're going to give me a bunch of anxiety.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, I mean, when we are making the changes, then what is it that you have to, what are those 3 must-haves that have to come with anytime that you're going to make a change, especially in the behavioral health space? What are the 3 things that you have to have before we get into how it gets done? Sure, you want to take that one?
I can speak to this a little bit. Actually, I realize, Dara, how passionate you are. So if you'd like to go first, go ahead. But if not, I can go.
I'm passionate about reducing my anxiety from the side before.
Well, I can just maybe provide some general context. Again, the way we started this webinar with Les talking about how prevalent, mental health challenges are in the country, me being a population health expert, what that tells me is that every other subset of the population is probably going to have a similar experience. Plus or minus some kind of changes. But, so for instance, if that's the case for the US, a lot of employee populations will have a similar profile. And so as employers, it's important to acknowledge we may have something that we need to look at from a perspective of what would be the needs of our employee population. Is our employee population suffering the same as the U.S. kind of national assessment? And, you can look at that through, potentially EAM, not EAM, but EAP, employee assistance programs, utilization. Those are kind of notoriously underutilized. So the signal there may not be very helpful. But there's other ways to do kind of resiliency screenings and things like that may kind of help you dive into what are the needs of your employee population. And then once you have a kind of a baseline understanding of the need, then looking very specifically by evaluating what should we care about as an organization, because every organization has limited resources. So looking at the things that can be addressed that provide the most benefit to the most, or what things would need to be addressed from the most kind of critical outcome, so to speak, and then how do you move forward and commit to action? So, again, I think it's very powerful to realize like behavioral health is a major challenge to the country, but it's also a major challenge for every subpopulation of the country.
You bet. Absolutely. Dara, was there anything you wanted to add to that before we jump towards the other?
No.
Okay.
No, I want to get to the next section.
Yeah. So here we kind of reach this place where it's like, okay, so what are we looking at, and why is it then that some of these things aren't working? And whenever I saw this and I was looking at the stats and it was like 70%, and my jaw dropped. It's like, how could 70% of the time that we go to make changes in our process, how is it that it fails? And so when we look forward with those and kind of what was going on there, there was a book. I think that Tony Robbins, he always has great ideas as well. But there was also one that was there from, two of the U.S. Navy SEAL commanders, and they were talking about how is it that you can make change happen and what goes wrong. And so, Dara, I'll let you kind of kick this off and maybe start us at the beginning here of what it is, why this doesn't work. What is it that we're missing in this picture of what's being lost?
I think that it's the how. I think we'll talk a little bit about the how, because I think that, first step is to acknowledge that something needs to change, right? And really even just acknowledging that is a big step. And I know Dr. Kertay has pretty strong feelings about that too. And discussing with your population that you are committed to change and that there is this effort behind the change, and then asking for input. I think that's where we encourage everybody to start, because if you don't start there, and again, this is something we've heard very loud and clear from employees in different surveys and focus groups that we've done, that if they feel like their employer is shoving something down their throat without their buy-in, that they really struggle to buy in. And so, it seems some of these seem so logical. They seem like such small things, but starting somewhere, we have to start somewhere. And I think starting simple is really great. Just start with asking how we can help, how we can do better. I think that's, in my opinion, a great way of getting somewhere. Les, what do you think?
I agree. I think that asking and also making, when you said the thing about, because we have heard that a lot, that just offering something and sort of pushing it at people isn't very helpful. But what came to mind there is like an EAP service, right? Well, we just offer that, so go do whatever, instead of having a conversation about what this could do for you. Right?
You bet.
Here's what it's done for me in my life to be able to talk about it. As an executive, having that conversation with people in the workplace makes a huge difference. Whereas just offering a service by itself isn't the answer. It's really about understanding what they want and need, and then offering it in a way that's really practical and that gets support from the top down. I think those are the two key components.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So once we so I think what I'm hearing you say is that we need to ask about it, but then also make it something that's practical. Would that be a fair summary of your input there? And so then what would come after that?
Practical and personal. I think I'd say practical and personal. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Talk us through the next piece that's missed.
I think in response to this quote, which I think is a really good one, it makes the point that it's not that we're not talking about performance or excusing poor performance, right? We're we're using somebody's performance as a question mark to say, okay, so is that happening because the person doesn't have the resources they need? Is it happening because they're not the right fit for the job? Or is it happening because something's going on in their life that if we had, if we addressed it and supported it, they could do it. It's not that you ignore the performance piece of it. It's that you understand that you're dealing with people, and by supporting them, you're going to get better performance. But at the end of the day, I think everybody's afraid, that if we offer too much or if we're too compassionate, that somehow we'll let people get away with poor performance. That's not what this is about at all. And in fact, we know, for example, that people respond better to realistic, concrete feedback than to mindless or empty support, right? So I think that it's a false dichotomy we set up, and that contributes to attempts to support the workforce. I think it contributes to those efforts failing because we confuse those things.
Yeah, maybe what I would add on, kind of dovetail into what Les was saying is, with any, in the military or in any company where there's a mission, whether it's product delivery or service, you need effective leadership, but you also need ownership. And so I have actually read a lot of Jocko Willink's work, and he's a retired leader in the Special Operations Department with multiple deployments, and what he really focuses on is he was the leader of a SEAL team. However, there was lots of ownership outside of his leadership that made things work. And so, if a company is looking to address mental health, which is not going to be easy because of all the challenges we've been discussing, having an effective leadership role, but also having ownership across the organization, even at the individual level, like as individual contributors, they need to be aware of themselves and their others. Obviously they may need some training and resources, but again, if there's no one specifically being accountable, then and you may not be accountable for yourself when you're in crisis. And I think that bill that was recently passed for that ER doctor who took her life because her ER was overrun by COVID. I think there's this bigger discussion about, well, you need to be responsible for yourself, but your team around you, even if you're the leader of the team, needs to be responsible for each other. And so I think that's maybe part of the discussion is we're all responsible, in the military, you're responsible for yourself and you're responsible for your battle buddy. But I think this can be largely adopted. And so you don't have to be formally a leader in an organization to have ownership. And so I think that's something that would be an effective tool and an organizational structure for something that we're trying to change here, which will not be easy.
For sure. Yeah. We've had a lot of good questions that have been, put in the chat here, and I wanted to kind of push some of those out. Let's see, and kind of get your thoughts. Jennifer was asking about, she's seeing that there's issues such as stress, unrealistic expectations, limited resources that are causing people to leave companies because they're being dismissed simply because the job market is so competitive right now. And so the question was, do you have any suggestions on how it is that you could give these issues more visibility? That's an excellent question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, one thing here, if I'm understanding the question the way that Jennifer put it, it's, we're tending to ignore the real stressors that are happening in the workplace and just passing it off as, well, people are just quitting because they can get a better job. Well, if you're not asking your people, seriously, making efforts to understand what the workforce's experience is, you're missing real opportunities to make a difference in the culture. And the fact of the matter is that no amount of me having good stress, I have pretty good behaviors around managing my stress. I'm pretty resilient as a person. But if the workplace stress is intolerable, if the demands that I have put on me are intolerable and I don't have the resources, there's no amount of, taking yoga classes or mindfulness meditation that's going to make that easier for me to do. And eventually, if I'm not heard, I'm going to leave. So
yeah, I'm sorry,
I go back to that. No, I go back to that. Like, first ask what it is that's going on. Sorry.
No, I think, as you were saying that, individually, like you said, you may be really good at coping or really good with resiliency, but as a population, if we're not paying attention to the workplace as a population and understanding the entire group as a system and as an organization instead of the individual. And I think that's where sometimes these program implementations fail, is they are going bottom up. They're trying to manage the individual's stressors or the individual's expectations. And often even the language, even what you were just describing around self-care, is individualized. It's on you to manage your self-care. And I think we've heard from a lot of employees that they don't necessarily expect the employer to solve all those issues either, but it's somewhere in between where we have to recognize that there is this opportunity to, yes, I could individually manage my stress level by doing these things, but if I'm in an organization that's not acknowledging or then supporting from the top down, then we're missing all this in between.
Yeah, no, one thing I'll add is kind of there is this power of population health or medical surveillance. And so I'll just give a quick physical example. So for instance, I used to manage lead exposures in a group of employees. And so, you're testing people who are exposed to lead in the workplace. And so if someone comes back positive, it could be they had not wore their protective gear, maybe they ate some lead. But if everyone or a majority of the coworkers in this one workplace, then I'm worried about very, very high levels of lead in the environment that overwhelm the protective natures. And so that really can be, when we are, entering now in this realm of helping employers with mental health, we look at individual, but also aggregate and population health resiliency scores. And so, if someone is having an issue, it may be a lack of resilience, like you said, Les, but if a lot of people or the majority of people are having it in a specific work group, then that actually tells leadership in that organization that we may be asking too much of our employees, and we need to look at it, whether it's for short term or long term. And so there really is this great power of individual and population health that provides this synergy,
For sure. We had several questions that were there, and they're kind of similar. So we'll roll those into the same thing. But speak. Maybe if we can do it very quickly. I know we're running out of time here, but quickly, how is it that you manage the difference in how people view mental health between generations? And along with that, how is it then that they may respond better to removing that stigma, to eliminating some of that judgment that comes along with that? Dr. Kertay, you have some quick points to share with us on that one?
Yeah, quick. One thing that's really interesting is that we have seen is that, and one of the questions I saw, mentioned this, that the younger part of the workforce is more likely to be talking about mental health. But interestingly, they're the least likely to seek traditional mental health services. So older workers are less likely to talk about it, but if they have a problem and acknowledge it, they're more likely to seek traditional treatment. So that standard thing that we offer, EAP sessions or, some sort of support for getting a mental health appointments may not be helpful for the people who are talking about this the most. We need a different kind of approach, this sort of population health monitoring, offering other kinds of services that will address overall stress in the workplace is probably going to be a lot more effective than simply throwing programs at people.
For sure, for sure.
So that's the one thing that really stands out for me about the generational differences.
Yeah. One last question. This one actually came, Janet had given us several questions, and I think we're going to give the award to Janet. She had some excellent ones that came through here. So Janet, I'll reach out to you and make sure that we get your information. But she was asking about how is it that you can recognize some of these things if it's not just a performance issue? How do you recognize it, and then what do you do about it? We've talked a lot about having conversations and just being real, asking people, being genuinely concerned with what's going on. And, that's not against the law of protected press.
Again, in recovering HR mode here, I like performance reviews for a lot of reasons. But if an organization has yearly performance reviews, that's probably not the best time to talk about situations like this. We should be having regular one-on-one conversations with our team and group conversations that allow for that free flow of information, that it's not about, I'm going to score you on a scale of 1 to 10. It should be much more about, as a leader, how do I support my team? How do I have a good enough relationship with them that if I do notice something's wrong, that I can bring it up? And to me, that's really where some of those conversations should be.
Absolutely.
Actually, guys, wanting to hear the answer is important.
Yeah, not blowing off the answer and
right.
saying, yeah, here's the EAP phone number.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Poor EAP number. Yeah. Guys, I think what my takeaway with this, and I hope that you guys feel the same, is just that there's a lot to discuss here. There's a lot to unpack, and I don't think it's something that we're going to be able to fix in a short time period. But if we can all work together on it, I definitely think we can advance the conversation forward. So thank you for attending. I know we're right at the end here, and we will follow up with each of you individually. Janet, I'll get in touch with you. Nicole had some great questions about social media as well. So we'll touch base with you, Nicole. Guys, if you haven't already, please hit that button, and let's talk about high functioning anxiety at the next event, because I have a feeling that you all have some great input that can make a big difference in what we're doing to try to make a difference in the world. Thank you again for attending. Thank you guys for presenting as well.
Bye-bye.